It is a case which is thought to be the longest miscarriage of justice in British legal history. An English woman with a scandalous reputation found murdered in a Derbyshire graveyard in September 1973, the teenage groundsman falling directly under the veil of suspicion for the brutal crime. Despite serving time in prison for the murder, new findings discovered by an investigative journalist led to the groundsman being freed. But to this day, the truth surrounding the murder remains a mystery, as the woman's true killer has never been caught or brought to justice. In 1973, Wendy Sewell worked as a secretarial typist for the Forestry Commission and lived with her husband, David Sewell, in the village of Middleton by Yulgrave, around 5.5 miles away from the town of Bakewell, located in the Peak District, Derbyshire, England. The couple had a far from perfect relationship and broke up a number of times for a plethora of reasons, but David and Wendy continue to try and make the relationship work, despite their problems. Around 3 years prior to her death in 1970, Wendy reportedly gave birth to a son before putting him up for adoption. However, the father of the child is unknown. Wendy was known to have a rather promiscuous reputation, something which actually led the media to dubbing this case as the Bakewell tart killing, although this alleged scandalous behaviour is something which the Sewell family firmly deny. Wendy was rumoured to have had a string of boyfriends at the time of her death. She was known to have a liking towards outdoor sex and tended to slip Mars bar chocolates into the hands of men who took her fancy, this being a known sexual encounter signal from the 1960s. The 32-year-old tended to meet up with her various boyfriends during her work lunch breaks to have sex with them, this allegedly being a rather well-known fact in the area. She spent time with men of all sorts, married men and even men from influential local families. Many knew what Wendy got up to, but she didn't seem to care what anybody thought about her, and she never tried to hide what she was doing with these men. Wendy wasn't ashamed of her actions or her infidelity towards her husband, David. According to some witnesses who lived on the same street as the Sewells, when David left for work in the mornings, they would often see Wendy turn on the porch light to signal at various boyfriends that the coast was clear for them to rendezvous at the house. It is reported that during one of her breakups from David, Wendy moved into an apartment over a wool shop in town where she allegedly met up with a number of men before being asked to leave the property due to her rowdy behaviour. Shortly before her murder, Wendy and David once again reconciled and lived at the same address. However, Wendy continued to have ongoing relations with other men. On the 12th of September 1973, Wendy spent the morning at work at the Forestry Commission as usual. She told her co-workers that morning that she had an argument with her current boyfriend the night before, and at approximately 12 p.m, Wendy spoke to her boyfriend either over the phone or in her office, this detail being unclear. Her boss, who was also on the phone in his own office at the time, heard raised voices coming from outside the door where Wendy's desk was situated. At approximately 12:40, Wendy entered her boss's office with a note which said she was going for a breath of fresh air and she would be taking her lunch break before returning back to work. According to those who worked with Wendy, she allegedly made some secret arrangements over the phone that morning with someone who was, quote, definitely not her husband. After exiting her place of work, Wendy took a stroll up to Bakewell Cemetery, entering at around 12:50 p.m. According to a witness named Charles Carman, on her way up to the cemetery, Wendy appeared to have bumped into one of her friends approximately 10 minutes prior to entering the graveyard at around 12:40. This friend claimed that the typist was in good spirits and that she was on her way to meet her boyfriend to make up after the previous night's disagreements. Several other sources state that Wendy was also headed towards the cemetery to visit the grave of her late father. Just moments after entering Bakewell Cemetery, which was located on a small hill, Sewell was bludgeoned to death, beaten on the head with the handle of a pickaxe. She also appeared to have been sexually assaulted before being left for dead. Her trousers, underwear, shoes, and a part of her bra had been removed by her attacker. A bloody-faced Wendy Sewell was then found by the 17-year-old groundsman, Stephen Downing. Downing was described as being a gentle teenager who had the reading age of an 11-year-old. He could barely read or write and didn't have any qualifications to his name. Stephen was allegedly quite an introverted individual, but he worked hard nonetheless. The teenager lived with his parents and his sister at an address located near to the cemetery. He kept 2 baby hedgehogs he had rescued as pets in the garden shed. Stephen carried out a number of odd jobs at the chapel as well as working as the groundskeeper for the local council at Bakewell Cemetery. On the day in question, the 12th of September 1973, at approximately 1 p.m, Downing stoked the fire in the chapel before putting on his coat and heading home for lunch. He also intended to feed his hedgehogs and at the garden shed during this time. On his way out of the chapel grounds, walking along the path towards the entrance of the cemetery, Downing claimed to have seen Wendy Sewell caught, quote, striding back and forth behind the chapel on a parallel path close to the wood. Downing thought nothing of it and continued on his way, walking back towards his home. Several witnesses backed up Downing's claims, with many local residents seeing him leave the graveyard in his usual, quote, unhurried, shambling gait. He certainly did not seem to be acting out of the ordinary. Downing arrived home a few minutes later, boiled the kettle and went into the garage to change his boots before sitting down for lunch with his mother, who arrived home approximately 7 minutes later. The two chatted whilst eating lunch together, and around 20 or so minutes later, at approximately 1:20 p.m, Downing finished his lunch break and walked towards the garden shed to feed the hedgehogs, waving at a male individual who was in the graveyard gatehouse. Approximately 5 minutes passed, and the man at the gatehouse was startled by loud banging on the front door. He opened it and was greeted by 17-year-old Stephen Downing, who, in a very panicked manner, told the man that a woman had been brutally attacked in the cemetery. Stephen later told police that he found the woman lying on the ground, naked from the waist down, covered in blood. She was making guttural sounds in her throat, and as Stephen tried to speak to the woman, she started thrashing her head about, causing blood to spatter onto Stephen's clothing. He guided police to the exact spot where Wendy was and pointed out a pickaxe which was lying on a nearby path, presumably the weapon used to strike Sewell over the head. At around the same time of discovering Wendy lying in the graveyard grounds, 3 workmen arrived at the cemetery and accompanied Downing to where Sewell was lying in order to help her. As Wendy actually saw the 4 men approach, she tried to regain her footing. However, she suddenly started stumbling about before falling over and smacking her head off a gravestone. The men contacted police and called for an ambulance, who arrived shortly afterwards. Wendy was still breathing, but unfortunately she fell unconscious on the way to Chesterfield Royal Hospital. Tragically, 32-year-old Wendy Sewell succumbed to her injuries less than 3 days later. Stephen Downing was greatly affected by the events of that afternoon. Police took him in for questioning, despite him being in a severe state of shock, and almost immediately the groundsman was the police's prime suspect in Wendy Sewell's murder. The 17-year-old was arrested at around 2 p.m, although the fact he was being arrested was not made clear to him at the time. Stephen believed that he was solely being brought in for questioning to help the police with their inquiries into the brutal attack. Downing was actually questioned at the police station in Bakewell for a harrowing 9 hours, and despite having learning difficulties, he was not allowed to have a solicitor present, despite it being his right. He allegedly asked for a lawyer a number of times but was refused. Police even had the audacity to place bets with one another on whether Downing would actually confess to the crime or not. Stephen's parents, Ray and Juanita, arrived at the police station to be with their son, but were turned away multiple times by the officers on duty, the reasons as to why his parents were being turned away being unclear. Police kept the 17-year-old at the station until approximately 11:10 p.m, at which time Stephen would have been extremely tired and hungry, not to mention frustrated with so many questions being put to him about what had happened. Shockingly, the police subsequently wrote out a full confession for Downing, but he didn't understand half of the words written in this confession due to his learning difficulties. The confession, which was written in pencil, stated that Stephen had murdered and attacked Wendy Sewell with the handle of the pickaxe in a sexually motivated crime. Stephen hadn't had any romantic relationships by this point, and police actually saw this as his motive. After hours of grueling questioning, the police eventually managed to persuade Stephen to sign the confession without even knowing the true extent as to what he was confessing to. Almost immediately afterwards, however, Downing retracted his confession, but this didn't change anything. Downing was subsequently put on trial 6 months later, between the 13th and 15th of February 1974 at Nottingham Crown Court. He stood before Mr. Justice Neild and a jury, where Downing pleaded not guilty to the murder of Wendy Sewell. The bloodstains found on Stephen's jeans and his alleged confession were the two main factors which led to his subsequent conviction. The forensic pathologist who was present at the trial stated that the blood found would only have been present on Downing's clothing if he had been responsible for the crime, and this on its own appeared to be enough to sway the jury to make up their minds about Downing's guilt. After just 1 hour of deliberations, Stephen Downing was found guilty of murder by unanimous verdict and was subsequently sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. He was actually ineligible for parole by English law due to the fact that he would not confess to being involved in the murder, but despite this, Stephen didn't give up hope that someday the truth would out. Downing's first appeal happened in October of 1974, when a witness came forward claiming to have seen Stephen leaving the cemetery, and that following his departure the witness saw Wendy Sewell alive and unharmed. The witness statement was concluded by the court to actually be unreliable due to some trees which would have been obstructing her line of sight. The court did not find the witness statement credible enough to allow an appeal against Downing's conviction, especially since the witness was short-sighted. Stephen Downing proclaimed his innocence from the beginning and continued to do so for 27 years, with his parents Ray and Juanita continuing to stand by their son during this time. Downing could have technically walked free in 1991, but he continued to proclaim his innocence, therefore could not be released on parole. The case seemingly hit a dead end following the 1974 appeal. However, Don Hale, the editor of the local newspaper, the Matlock Mercury, was contacted by Stephen's parents 20 years later in September 1994. The couple told Hale that they actually had received an anonymous letter from a woman who had claimed to have sent Hale new information which could prove their son's innocence. Despite his concerns and doubts about taking the case on, Don Hale decided to pursue a grueling 6-year campaign to overturn Stephen Downing's murder conviction. Hale looked through the various records of the trial and investigation and managed to uncover a number of shocking revelations in regards to the case. Firstly, the confession of Stephen Downing was sent to a handwriting expert who concluded that the document had been tampered with in some way, and at this time it was realised that Stephen couldn't have possibly written this confession. This was primarily due to the fact that the language used was far too advanced for him to have known. Hale also found that the forensic report actually determined that no sexual assault had occurred, going completely against the alleged motive of the crime, which was suggested to be a sexual assault. Something else which did not seem to add up was that Stephen claimed in the so-called confession that he had struck Wendy twice over the head with the pickaxe handle, but the forensic report contradicted this and stated that the deceased had been hit up to 8 times by a right-handed assailant. Quite astonishingly, Stephen was left-handed. Hale found there to be far too many inconsistencies in these reports, especially on the prosecution side at the trial. Hale concluded that police incompetence was likely to blame here. According to Hale's investigations, a thorough search of the murder scene was never conducted, therefore crucial pieces of evidence could have easily been missed, such as DNA, footprints, or clothing fibres. Wendy allegedly had a wicker basket, a handbag and a purse in her possession when she went to the graveyard, but these items were never recovered. Did the assailant take them, or was there something far more dangerous and damning at play here, such as a police cover-up? Though purely speculation, it is a theory which is believed by many. A modern forensic examination was also conducted on the pickaxe handle, which had actually been put on display and at the Derby Museum. Using DNA methods which were not available during the initial investigation, authorities found Wendy's DNA on the weapon. However, it also revealed that no fingerprints on the pickaxe matched Stephen Downing. Rather interestingly, however, there was a bloody handprint on the handle belonging to a yet unidentified person. More shockingly, Hale's investigation revealed that the jury had failed to be informed of Downing's learning difficulties at the trial. Therefore, they did not have all the facts to make a well-informed decision regarding their verdict. Hale was shocked with the vast amount of mistakes and negligence made by police in the case, so decided to go back to the beginning for himself and search for any witnesses to speak to. After conducting various door-to-door inquiries, Don Hale was given some rather interesting information from an elderly woman living in one of the houses overlooking the cemetery. The woman told Hale that she had actually seen a van parked outside the cemetery entrance at the time of the murder, and that she had witnessed two male individuals acting suspiciously. Concerned, the elderly woman wrote down the van's registration number and descriptions of both men on the back of a cigarette box, before going to police to tell them about the unusual incident. However, they had actually turned her away, stating that what she saw was, quote, likely nothing to worry about. As it turned out, this woman was not the only witness who was apparently cast aside by police in regards to Wendy Sewell's murder. The woman kept the cigarette box for over 22 years and gave it to Don Hale during his investigation. He managed to trace the registration of the vehicle back to a man known to Wendy Sewell, the boyfriend that she was meeting that fateful afternoon. Hale took this new information to court to ask for an appeal, but it was rejected. Despite this setback, it didn't take long for further evidence to come to light, which also cast doubt on Stephen Downing's conviction. Other witnesses claimed to have seen a man, notably not Stephen Downing, covered in blood fleeing the scene, a man who was actually identified, but for unknown reasons the police didn't pursue this individual. A woman named Jane Atkins Bentley, who was a teenage runaway around the time of Wendy's murder, read about the so-called Bakewell tart case in a newspaper while working at a restaurant, and she confirmed to Hale that she had seen Stephen Downing leaving through the entrance of the graveyard at approximately 1 p.m, corroborating his version of events. Jane was walking her dog through the cemetery at this time. She was somewhat familiar with Downing, as many locals were, and was certain it was him due to his distinctive walk. She also told Hale that following Stephen's departure from the cemetery, she too saw Wendy Sewell alive and well alongside her boyfriend. It's unknown if this was the same witness who originally came forward during the first appeal in 1974, though if so, her statement was dismissed by police. On the day of Downing's first appeal, Jane was told the wrong day. This witness was key to proving that Stephen Downing had left the cemetery before the murder took place. He simply could not have been in two places at once. Jane also allegedly heard a cry for help while walking back to the graveyard entrance, but she didn't really think anything of it and continued on her way. The three workmen who were on site by this time, on reflection, Jane thought that it may have just been the three of them messing about with one another. As Hale dug deeper into the case, according to a number of newspapers, things started to turn a little sinister for himself. He was allegedly almost hit by a car twice, and he received a chilling phone call from an unknown male stating that, quote, if you don't drop that story, you only have another couple of weeks to live. According to Hale, this confirmed to him that he was really closing in on the truth. Two lorries also smashed into the back of his car a number of times, and he was so frightened by this that he was forced to flee the scene by running through nearby fields. Things escalated even further, and they got so bad for Hale that the police gave him a mirror on a stick to check underneath his car for potential explosive devices. The police told him that, quote, For his own safety, he should drop the case. According to some, Hale was known to be on the verge of being obsessed when it came to Wendy's case, and as a result, he was nicknamed the Mad Dog of Matlock. A retired detective contacted Don a few years later and told him that he doubted some of the alibis given by those who were questioned in regards to the case. This detective was also allegedly threatened about delving further into the case by a superintendent in the police who actually had influence over the Wendy Sewell murder case. Not to mention, he was allegedly one of Wendy's lovers. Hale's campaigning for Downing's release continued as the years went by, and as a result of his efforts and Downing proclaiming his innocence, the case was referred to the Criminal Cases Review Commission in 1997. The same year, over 3,500 Bakewell residents signed a petition demanding Stephen to be released, which was then presented to Parliament by their local MP. The Court of Appeal eventually overturned Downing's conviction in 2002 after finding the conviction to be unsafe. It's not that they necessarily doubted his original conviction, but more so that the process was not conducted in a right and fair manner. Stephen had a very difficult time in jail. As a convicted sex offender, he was stabbed, scalded with hot water, tortured, abused, and sexually assaulted, which resulted in him moving to alternate prisons 8 times, spending some of his sentence in Dartmoor, Risley, and Wakefield. According to Downing, even some of the officers tried to persuade him to admit to the murder during his incarceration, but he never succumbed to the pressure. He believed in the legal system, despite its many flaws, and was certain that the truth would eventually come to light. In 2001, after 6 years of campaigning, 45-year-old Stephen Downing was released on appeal after 27 years behind bars, having spent the final months of his sentence at Littlehay Prison in Cambridgeshire. Following his release, Stephen returned to his family home and managed to secure work as a sous chef at a Bakewell restaurant, having had kitchen experience during his time in prison. Following the overturned conviction, the BBC hailed Stephen Downing's release as being, quote, a triumph for campaigning journalism and an end to one of the worst miscarriages of justice in English legal history. Following Stephen's release, a second appeal was launched in January 2002, where the Court of Appeal accepted a number of reasons given by Don Hale and a number of others believing the conviction to be unsafe. They agreed that Downing's original confession should not have been allowed to go before a jury due to the fact that he was questioned for over 8 hours, during which time Downing was suffering severely from shock, and the police allegedly kept shaking him and tugging at him to stop him from falling asleep. Downing was also not formally cautioned that anything said during the interview would be used against him, and of course he was refused the right to have a solicitor present. The Crown also agreed that the initial conclusion that the bloodstain found on the trousers would have only been there if he had killed Wendy Sewell should be brought into question. The original conviction was found to be unfair, and that the reliability of the confession and forensic evidence was brought into doubt. The conviction against Stephen Downing was subsequently quashed. The police reinvestigated the murder under the name of Operation Noble, and during this time, authorities questioned over 1,500 witnesses and narrowed down potential suspects to 22 individuals, many of whom had already been suggested by Don Hale during his campaign for justice. All 22 suspects were cleared of having any involvement in Wendy Sewell's death. After police failed to link any other individuals to the murder, the police officially closed the case. They had exhausted all of their leads and wrote in a statement in 2002 that Wendy Sewell's case would only ever be reopened if any new substantial evidence surfaced. According to what Don Hale was told by the police, many of the original witness statements and collected evidence were reportedly lost or destroyed. However, in 2014, a former detective uncovered a pathology report which was allegedly hidden by police within days of Wendy's murder in 1973. The pathology report completely contradicted what was in Downing's alleged confession. This report would have prevented such a despicable miscarriage of justice, not to mention would have exonerated Stephen Downing. Many couldn't and still don't understand why such an important piece of evidence was kept under wraps, unless there was some sort of cover-up. Following a submission to the Home Secretary regarding the poor investigation conducted by Derbyshire police at the time, the police were forced to apologise for the way they conducted their investigations into Wendy Sewell's murder. The judges also claimed that the officers who interviewed Stephen Downing were guilty of substantial and significant breaches of the rules in which they conducted themselves when questioning him. As a result of not being informed at the time that he was under arrest, and the fact that he was refused a solicitor when being questioned, Stephen Downing received a total of £750,000 in compensation. 50 years have passed, and the murder of Wendy Sewell remains unsolved. We know next to nothing about her alleged boyfriend who was last seen with her at the cemetery prior to her death. According to witnesses, the man had sandy-coloured, shoulder-length hair and was wearing a denim jacket and a pair of jeans, but other than this, there is nothing publicly known about him. It is widely believed that the residents of Bakewell know exactly who murdered Wendy Sewell in 1973, but are keeping the truth close to their chests, likely in fear for their lives. Even Don Hale claimed in a BBC article titled "Who Did Kill Wendy Sewell" that the evidence clearly points to one person in particular and a couple of associates who deliberately tried to cover the evidence up. Despite this bold claim, justice is still yet to be served for the 32-year-old typist. This case is thought to be the longest miscarriage of justice in British legal history. The murder of Wendy Sewell attracted worldwide media attention at the time, and even a drama series was made based on the events. The Bakewell Tart murder has intrigued many professional and amateur detectives and web sleuths alike over the years, but the fact of the matter still remains. An innocent man spent much of his adult life behind bars for a crime he simply could not have committed. The police failed Stephen Downing, and they failed Wendy Sewell, whose killer has never been unmasked or brought to justice.